Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Hi, I am Roberto Mazza, and this is Jerusalem Unplugged, your getaway into the multi-layered narratives of this iconic city. Each episode, I will guide you through Jerusalem's mesmerizing chronicles and present-day reality. With leading experts as guests, we will examine the city's intricate past, raging socio-political debates, and nuances of its cosmopolitan culture. Let this podcast be your immersive audio expedition, allowing you to experience the spiritual resonance, political tension, and dynamic voices that define Jerusalem's powerful mystique. Join me on this thought-provoking journey. Today, my guest is Fida Jiyris. Fida is the author of Stranger in My Own Land, Palestine, Israel, and One Family's Story of Hope. After 1993 Oslo Accords, a handful of Palestinians were allowed to return to their hometowns in Israel. And Fida Jiyris and her family were among them. This beautiful memoir charts the journey in Palestine's from the Nakba to the present, a 75-year tale of conflict, exodus, occupation, return, and a search for hope. Fida reveals how her father, an advisor to Yasser Arafat, chose exile in 1970. Her childhood in Beirut was shaped by the Lebanese Civil War and the 1982 Israeli invasion, which led to her mother's death. 13 years later, the family made an unexpected return to Fassouta, their Galilean village of origin. Fida, 22, and full of love for her country, no idea what she was getting into. So Stranger in My Own Land chronicles a desperate, at times surreal, search for belonging between Palestine, Israel, and the diaspora, asking difficult questions about what the right of return would mean for millions of Palestinians waiting to come back. But before we delve into all of this, first things first, Fida, welcome.
Thank you very much, Roberto. It's great to be with you today.
So, the book is very much about your father, yourself, and Palestine. So, I normally start, interviews asking about the author. But in this case, I want to discuss this throughout the interview, as we will discover yourself, obviously, your father, and Palestine in the period that you're discussing throughout all of the other questions. However, I really want to start with the book itself, and I want to ask, why did you decide to write the book in the first place? And also, how did you put it together, particularly in terms of research, sources, creating the dialogues, which are so poignant and powerful throughout the book?
Thank you, Roberto. The decision to write the book came about through a slow process. I had spent, we'll talk about this a little bit later in the interview, but I had spent my life in the various places of Palestinian existence, if we can call it that. So I and my family experienced life as Palestinians in 1948 Palestine or Israel. I lived in the West Bank as well, and we had come from the diaspora. This, somewhat unique perspective was one of my drivers for the book, because I was trying to capture, in a sense, our unique history as a family, and through it to tell the story of Palestine. The main idea, the reason really the book came about is because, as I had mentioned, in my years abroad, and in meeting so many people in various countries through work and study and through being born and living in the diaspora, I often encountered the question, we know there's a problem between Palestinians and Israelis. We know that Palestinians have a problem, but we don't really know the details. And many people would come to me and would ask me. And it was my dream really to write a book that could offer a one book introduction to the Palestinian question. Really the way I went about it is both by desk research and by lengthy interviews with my family and with friends of the family in some instances, or with people that my father knew who would shed light on the story. I conducted lengthy interviews with my family members, and I went back again and again on certain parts of our story. Through this, what I hoped to create was the history of Palestine through the story of our family. So I didn't want it to be just a dry, if you like, a history book. But I was trying to lend more animated story, more animated life into it by telling the story of my family. And so the dialogues I imagined as I was being told this information from various members of my family. And I tried to make it really a cross between almost a fictional explanation of our story or a narrative, and at the same time, very much nonfiction with the story of Palestine woven through it.
Now, I want to set the context for the book. And so this is why you wrote the book and how you wrote the book. And I want to talk about the center of the book, which is your village. So I want to talk about Fassouta, which is your not only center of your family, but I would say some sort of the center of your own world, through my reading of the book. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the village, its location, its population, and also some history, particularly around 1948, that probably many people may not know about the fate of those villages in that period of time.
Yes, Fassouta is a village, a Palestinian village in today's Israel. It's in the Galilee in the north of the country, but we are right on the Lebanese border, more or less halfway between Safad and the sea. So we are right on the border. We're only about 3 kilometers away or so. In this war, for example, we can often see the shelling back and forth between Israel and South Lebanon. Fassouta is an entirely Catholic village. In 1948, this part of the Galilee was really the last part to be occupied by the Zionist forces. The village fell in October 1948, but it was luckier than many of the villages around it in being able to survive. I mean, there were a couple or three attempts to expel its residents. I talk more about this in the book. But the village survived with some of the villages in the surrounding area. Others were expelled. The people were expelled either across the border into Lebanon or internally. In that sense, the story in the book begins there because my father was 10 years old at the time of the Nakba, and he saw people from the surrounding villages leaving. And this event, as a small child, I mean, really paved his path for the rest of his life. He was very much moved by what he saw, even though as a child he didn't understand what was happening, but it really was the cornerstone for how his life would pan out. Fassouta as a village is very remote. I mean, we are, nestled inside the in northwest Galilee in the mountains. It's a very beautiful, picturesque setting, but it's also very isolated. So its people really have maintained a tight cohesion through the times. But other than that, really, we are representative of, like many other villages in our area that remained after 1948. They lived under military rule after the founding of Israel for about 20 years. And they became Israeli citizens. So in that respect, their experience was very different from the surrounding people from surrounding villages who had been expelled. I've been in the village since we returned after the Oslo Accords, on and off. I've also been in, lived in many other places. And the village is always this place where I feel the ancestral belonging. Both my parents are from here, and I always feel that this is the place I keep returning to. Even after I travel and I go to other places, this is always the place where I keep revolving and coming back to.
Which is fascinating, and we will discuss that later, because you were not born there, but still you have this kind of connection with the village, which obviously shows the roots, within the village itself. So let me ask about the question of your father. You already mentioned him, and as I said at the very beginning, your father is one of the three main characters of the book, being you and Palestine itself, the other two. Can you just introduce him? And also perhaps you can discuss a little bit about your family so that the listeners can familiarize with the stories that we're going to unpack throughout the interview.
Yes, my father's name is Sabri Jiryis. As I said, he was 10 years old during the Nakba, and he went on to study high school in Nazareth and then to study law at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The decision to study law was really through his desire to do something for his people, for his cause. He felt very much the injustice even at a young age because, as I mentioned, he came under military rule like everybody else in the remaining Palestinian community in Israel at the time. Just to explain a bit about the context of that time, about 160,000 Palestinians only remained in what became Israel. They were very much a minority, and they were really like lost people that almost like the rug had been pulled out from under their feet. Most of their fellow Palestinians from what became Israel were expelled. So many of the villages stood empty. So many of them were razed to the ground during the Nakba and in subsequent years. He saw all this, and from a young age, I would say from about 15 or 16, he in high school, he became a Nasserite, as was, a prevailing trend among Palestinian youth at the time. And he then, in the Hebrew University, became one of the leaders of Al-Ard. Al-Ard was the first Palestinian national movement to emerge in Israel after the founding of the new state. And he was really, together with the others, he was really hassled because of his work. He endured periods of administrative detention, of house arrest. They were very much hounded. But at the same time, he practiced law. He finished his law degree, and he practiced law with Hanna Nakara, who was then known as the land lawyer. And they were really working to prevent the seizure of lands as much as possible by the new Israeli state of Palestinian lands. After the 1967 war, things got worse, obviously. And my father then began to be more engaged in underground political work, especially with the newly emerging Fatah. And in 1970, he finally left to Lebanon. It was a voluntary exile, really. He left with my late mother. And from there, the story unfolds. Eventually, just briefly, he directed the Palestine Research Center of the PLO. And after the Oslo Accords, we were allowed to come back here, but we were really less than 10 people after the entire Accords that could actually come back to their historic villages, to their native villages or towns of origin inside Israel itself. So going back, our story is very unique in that respect. My father, certainly in his years of exile, he never expected to be able to return. Although, when I was interviewing him for the book, he told me I always knew that I would come back. But at the same time, it was, a very far, remote dream. So we exemplify the right of return in that sense.
I want to talk about the question of Palestinians that remained, like your father and your family, in Israel after 1950. Now, back then, these 160,000 Palestinians represented around 10% of the population. Nowadays, roughly speaking, 20, 21% of the population. So there's been certainly an important growth. And for a long time, there was not much interest in even studies written about, other than obviously your father's book, which is important, and we're going to probably mention that, about the Arabs, the Palestinians that remained in Palestine. What I found very interesting is that since October 7, there's been some sort of a pickup in, in the ways people start looking at Palestinians in Israel, and all of a sudden, not just scholars, but even pundits and journalists actually remember that Palestinians had been under military rule for almost 2 decades. And so I was wondering if you can talk about their condition, what the military rule meant to them, and what were the consequences of this particularly rule, and also about marginalizations and their relations with Israelis that today may look very different from what they were 75 years ago.
Yes, the military rule system was really, I need to start by saying that it was extremely dehumanizing at its core. It was really born out of Israel's desire to be rid of all the Palestinians on it, and for various reasons, this portion of Palestinians stayed in their country, and they formed a very big problem for the newly established state, which wished, to establish itself as a purely Jewish state, and to kind of, by getting rid of all of these people, it hoped to eradicate their memory. The number that stayed within Israel's borders caused a grave problem for it, and it dealt with this problem by an extreme system of repression that was instated as quickly as possible. Military rule basically meant that people had very little agency over their own lives. So a military governor was appointed for all the areas in which the Palestinians lived at the time, mainly the Triangle and the Galilee, and again, some of them stayed in the Nakba, in the Negev region. Any movement from one place to another, from one village to another, people's normal travel for work, for study, for anything they needed to do, needed a permit from the military governor. Eventually, everything needed a permit, all social activities, all cultural events, even applying for jobs. Very quickly, the system of military rule was used as a kind of carrot and stick. So the authorities would try to enlist collaborators from among the Palestinians and would reward them by lifting certain restrictions, or through monetary rewards, through giving them jobs and so on, and would punish the rest, notably those who expressed opposition to the system. Really, the military rule infiltrated so much into people's lives that, I have a quote in the book. It said, when it was finally lifted, it said for 18 years, somebody said, this had nestled, in people's bed sheets, between father and son, between husband and wife, between parents and children. All people's movements were watched. They were under constant surveillance. Reading the wrong newspaper, listening to the wrong radio channel could land someone in so much trouble. So it was a very draconian system of rule over people's lives that was really only lifted when Israel occupied the new areas in 1967. And essentially what it did is transfer this apparatus of military rule there. Relations, obviously, under the system between, Palestinians and Jewish Israelis were very strained, if they existed. Typically, since the founding of the state, the prevailing Israeli view of the native Palestinian population has always been one of condescension, of contempt, of looking down on them, and the so-called coexistence was very much based on a premise that these are the people who do the work that the Jews don't really want to do in the state. And it was really true that for a couple of decades or even more, the Palestinians were enlisted to do all the difficult manual labor. They were paid poorly. Their villages were neglected. They didn't receive state budgets in the same way that Jewish localities did. It was a clear blanket system of discrimination from day one. The relationships between Palestinians and Israelis. I mean, I say Israeli Jews just to differentiate them from the Palestinians who also hold Israeli citizenship, which is the segment we're talking about. Today, these relationships may look very different on the surface, but in my experience, certainly it's been exposed again with this war. It's very fragile, this cover for normality or for coexistence, because very quickly, with any round of conflict, we see how it's not really based on proper coexistence, but rather on the need to get by. The prevailing view towards Palestinian citizens remains. We hear it at all levels of governmental, social, educational levels. We hear it everywhere. All kinds of people in senior positions of Israelis making statements like, these are a demographic problem, they are a demographic threat, we need to request loyalty. We had the nation state law back in 2018. So really, this thread or this ethos of how the state dealt with the Palestinians has very much remained. It's just kind of changed form from time to time. Although the system of military rule was lifted, Palestinians today are still discriminated against in so many aspects of our lives.
Sometimes I hear people telling me, oh, but look at Lucy Ayoub, for instance, right? Which is a very important character in the Israeli show business. She's, personality. I could say also, actress, journalist, activist in many ways. But she's more the exception than the rule. Yes. And I think she made it because she was able to break that ceiling, but the majority cannot. And I think we shouldn't look at that as some sort of a normal daily relations between Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians. I mean, Palestinian citizens of Israel, but she's an exception, right?
Yes, and also, we really what needs to look at the spectrum of things. In other words, you need to look at, okay, what kind of budgets are given for Palestinian localities versus Jewish ones? What kind of opportunities for advancement do people have in their jobs? I have my own relatives that have, that work, some of them in governmental agencies and hospitals and so on, and they will repeatedly complain bitterly about this glass ceiling that nobody really talks about, but that we know is in place when it's time for promotions, when it's time for pay raises. We also need to look at, our education system. How much freedom of expression is there really for Palestinians? There is a lot that goes on in the state's relationship to its Palestinian citizens, and really none of us really feel like proper citizens, like we should, if you hold the citizenship of a country. Again, at government level, we are constantly hammered, but you get representation in the Israeli parliament. Sure, we do, but, we are, our representatives are screamed at, are insulted, are thrown outside sessions, are prevented from voicing what they want to say, and really have very, very little weight, if at all, in any government decisions or policies. Now, the fact that there are people, of course there are people, there are many examples, but they are not the norm or the rule. They are certainly not the experience of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that struggle every day here to make ends meet.
I want to go back to your father now. And as you mentioned, he studied law at Hebrew University. He learned Hebrew, which we will see later actually was instrumental in his work for the PLO. And also became politically active, and he was one of the founders of Al-Ard. So can you speak broadly about this period of life, giving us some, interesting story details, but obviously not giving out everything, since we want the readers of the book exploring the history and the figure of your father.
Yes, and Roberto, as I said, I mean, he was an oddball in that sense, because the decision to keep going to university, there were few Palestinian graduates at the time, or indeed few Palestinians studying at university as a percentage of the remaining population. We have to remember the context that these people had been seriously battered, and that, for many parents, being able to send their children to university was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. So much land had been confiscated. People's livelihoods were really, curtailed. It was a very difficult situation. My father was lucky in that my grandfather was able to send him to university. And once there, my father really went on his own path, very much a nationalist path where he was acutely aware of his country, of his people, of the process of injustice that had happened. And his decision to go into political work immediately brought very grave consequences because the newly established Israel certainly didn't want any Palestinian dissidents within it. But he stuck to this path. He very much believed in it. And he was really an oddball because even in the village, I mean, there were not other cases who had taken such a clear path away from the ordinary as he did. Eventually, he really paid the price for this. I mean, he was exiled from the country. Later, he lost my mother in the war on the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and its aftermath in 1983. He really experienced, exile for 24 years of his life. He battled so many disappointments and failures, if we can call them that, of the PLO, of the political process. He came back here. That was also fraught with a lot of stress and uncertainty. So certainly he has held on because of his belief that he has in the need for a resolution of his people's crisis, of the disaster that befell us in 1948 and the ensuing, complexities. Until today, he remains very much, he's 86 now. He remains very much an avid reader, a follower of the news now. He follows the news around the clock. He always has. He continues to write, he continues to analyze, and he continues to hope, even when there's very little around us, sometimes to instill any sense of hope.
Let me ask about your mother, Anne. So your parents got engaged in September 1967. And I was wondering if you can talk about their relation within the context of the unfolding events, which also included the Six-Day War and eventually their choice to leave 3 years later.
Yes, my mother was not really into political work. She was also a student at the Hebrew University, although she studied there several years after my father. My father actually met her in the village and found out that she was studying at the university. But she was not really into political work, although she would later go into research in the center and accompany him on his journey. Certainly, they were affected by the war, as were the other Palestinians in Israel at the time. Suddenly, new possibilities were opened up for them. East Jerusalem, for example, had been previously inaccessible to them because it had been under Jordanian rule, and suddenly, after the war, they were able to go there for the first time. But at the same time, the system of repression only got stronger and uglier after the war because of the new sense of Israeli victory and the kind of uncontested strength. The fact that they had beaten the Arab armies. Israel was really drunk on its own victory in that war, and as such was even less willing to listen to any alternative point of view or to calls for peace or to calls for withdrawal. And it cracked down even more harshly on the Palestinians, both within the newly created areas and the newly conquered areas, and also within its own borders. The decision to leave in 1970 came after long periods, really, of administrative detention for my father. My father and mother, as newlyweds, didn't really have proper space or really a moment of peace. My father was constantly hounded. And finally, in 1970, there was word from friends of my father that somehow knew, friends abroad, that knew that there were probably plans to imprison him for a long time. So my parents had to make the very painful decision to leave. And it was painful because for them, they had known no other life other than in the country. They knew they were leaving their families behind. they didn't know when they would ever be able to see them again. But they made the decision together because my mother knew that if they didn't make this decision, there was the very real possibility that my father would be in prison for a long, long time.
I will leave the bureaucratic details of, sort of their escape and then eventually return for the readers, because I think those are fascinating. Also, the questions about documents and papers, this feeling of oppression, not knowing what's going to happen, what kind of documents I need. And there is an interesting story about, I think, your uncle that had a Sudanese passport. So there's a lot of complications there. But I think it's important for the readers to discover all of these. I want to ask now about Lebanon, because you used two very interesting titles for the period in Lebanon, Exile and Happy Times, which seems to go hand in hand, even though they end with a tragedy. So your parents moved to Beirut, you were born, your father was directing the Palestine Research Center, and then
things began to turn very ugly in 1975, with the Lebanese Civil War. Things began to get very, very messy in Lebanon. Initially, the PLO and the Palestinians stayed out of it, having made a decision that they wanted to focus on their own war with Israel, their war of liberation. But, as with any war, they were quickly dragged into it, embroiled in it. As young children, we were protected from most of this because my parents did the most they could to keep giving us a normal life. We were lucky not to live in the camps, but in West Beirut. And really, as young children, I think my initial feeling that something was very wrong was when Israel finally invaded Lebanon in June 1982. I was 9 years old, and I have vivid recollections of that period, which was really, really, really horrific. And in fact, as a side, I will say that Israel's mode of operation in the current Gaza war is almost, if not identical to what it did in Gaza, with the difference, of course, of the sophistication and the more deadly weapons that it uses. But it was the exact same mode of operation of cutting off all supplies from the citizens of a place, from the residents, besieging them. No food, no water, no electricity, no gas, nothing. And in those few weeks, I vividly recall, the complete trauma and disaster that our life was turning into, running from one place to another, seeking safety, of course, under the relentless Israeli bombing. Eventually, 3 months later, Sabra and Shatila as well. Very thankfully, as a young child, I was not exposed to any of that, but I could sense and I could hear what the adults were talking about. And then a few months after that, in February 1983, the Palestine Research Center, where both my parents worked, was targeted with a car bomb, and we lost my mother, along with several other employees of the center. The Beirut chapter is one of the darkest chapters of Palestinian history, the Lebanon chapter generally. Many survivors from this period will remember, the horrors that they encountered. For us, really, it was a very abrupt and very tragic end to our life there. And sure enough, in June, a few months later, we left. We were actually thrown out of Lebanon. The Lebanese authorities had made a deal with Israel to oust any remaining Palestinians affiliated with the PLO. And my father was expelled from the country. Then began the new chapter of our life in Cyprus. But Beirut, in the initial years that I was there, yes, it was our haven. It was really where I grew up and had my earliest memories, but it ended very violently.
You already talked about Lebanon, the question of the PLO and the Palestinians. So I want to ask something more personal. because the war took a massive toll on your family. Your mother died. In fact, she was killed in the bombing of a street in the heart of West Beirut in 1980. And things changed dramatically. You mentioned the PLO was expelled from Lebanon, your family grieving the loss of your mother, and uncertainty about the future brought you to move to Cyprus. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this period in your life, also about the daily challenges, how you felt, but also how did you, particularly your father, keep your Palestinian identity?
In Cyprus, the research center was reopened, although on a much smaller scale. What happened after that is a number of people who had either worked in the center in Beirut or who knew of the center, a small group of people also came to Cyprus to join the center and to work with my father. And he enrolled us in an English school. And from there, I mean, in terms of social networks, we quickly found friends both among Cypriots and also among the Palestinians and Lebanese that worked with my father at the center. But my father, I think, was always very keen to maintain our Palestinian identity. Shortly afterwards, he married my mother's sister, my aunt. And together, they really kept, first of all, they kept the memory of my mother very much alive in our home. And second, we always, spoke Arabic. My father insisted on continuing our Arabic lessons for us. I had already finished grade 5 in Lebanon. The initial period in Cyprus was very, very difficult. We missed our mother. It was like our whole world had just been completely pulled out from under our feet. We found ourselves in a strange alien environment. But Cyprus being this small island on the Mediterranean with such warm and friendly and hospitable people, I think, looking back on it now, is probably one of the best places we could have ended up in to try and care to our wounds. Within a few years, we managed to pick up our lives, but the initial period, I mean, I will always remember that fear and sadness and pain and uncertainty. We had a life, and suddenly all that life was just completely shredded and torn apart, and I lost, the dearest person in the world to me. I want to just, as a segue, just to tie that in to what is happening now in Gaza and indeed in the West Bank. More so, especially in Gaza, at the number of orphan children in this war, that's the first and immediate thing I always think about. It's very difficult, actually, to talk about this, but I always think of this sense of loss that these children will live with. I know what a mother's loss is at such a young age, and I know what kind of pain and instability that will mark the child's life for the rest of their life. Life is never the same after that loss psychologically. As the child tries to grapple through life, no matter how many kind people may come along, nothing is the same as a mother. And so today, when I think about these thousands upon thousands of children that have been orphaned, I realize that it just adds another, inhuman dimension really to the tragedy that we see.
Thank you for making this connection. I think it's an important one, particularly remembering the children. And it's interesting because I made another different connection when you were talking about, relocating from Lebanon, the question of Sabri and Shatila. And when I was reading the book, I was connecting with stories of other individuals who made different choices or were pushed to make different choices. For instance, in my experience as an Italian, growing up in the late 70s, early 80s in Italy, I remember at some point a wave of terrorist attacks, mostly perpetrated by Palestinian terrorists belonging to different organizations. And I want to highlight mostly secular because back then Hamas was not a reality. We're talking about Abu Nidal, Black September. And most of these terrorists were young individuals who were essentially recruited right after Sabri and Shatila. And, most of
Yes.
them were orphans. They lost a parent or both of them. And these organizations preyed on them and simply gave them a chance to, redeem themselves in some way or to give him a different future. And interestingly enough, some of them survived. And, many are still in Italy. And there was recently a podcast produced by a great Italian podcaster, Pablo Trincia. And the podcast is called Sangue Loro, which is the story of this Palestinian who, eventually at a very young age, right after Sabri and Shatila, was recruited, went to Italy, placed a bomb inside the British Airways office in the very center of Rome, captured. And then later on, he understood what happened was the reason why. And still, despite being obviously, very apologetic for what he has done, but still very attached to the cause and the ideas about, more or less the same ideas that your father would, write about. And so I thought about all of these sliding doors and often, coinciding with the question of, terrible situations which led and still lead children to be on their own. And eventually, we can't own their choices because they are made by others. And so I thought it was very interesting to see all of these connections in this very important period of time. I want to ask about events unfolding. And so while events were unfolding, a new era of hope was emerging, particularly, after the first Intifada, after the first round of talks in Madrid, and then eventually Oslo. And certainly this was not a straight path. We should remember that all things happen, but following, events that were unfolding, not necessarily in Palestine, but eventually led to a path of hope. Now, 1994 was a tough year for you and your family, mostly because financial means were lacking. And yet this was the year your father went back to Fassouta and you got to visit for the first time. And then July 1995, you eventually returned to the village.
Yes, 90 actually, the two things were connected, Roberto, and that's why 94 was a difficult year financially. So were the preceding few years because of the Gulf War and Arafat's decision at the time to express support for Saddam Hussein. It led to a big mess, and the PLO lost a lot of its sources of Gulf funding. Things were very, very precarious. The research center had more or less dwindled by then, lost most of its employees. It couldn't pay salaries. And so, one thing led to the other. Really, the PLO almost had no choice at that point, many would argue, but to try and salvage itself by, entering the Oslo process. Certainly, many analysts would, draw the correlation between these two things. So basically, this really led or eventually transpired in the Oslo Accords and in my father's visit. Now, in November 94, he came back for the first time after 24 years of exile. And really, that in itself was an event of such enormous magnitude to him and to us as a family. And the way he was received, in the village was people were absolutely stunned. I mean, nobody had expected to see him back here. We came back only a couple of weeks later at Christmas for my first visit. And I remember being absolutely stunned, and my breath was taken away by the fact that we were back in Fassouta, in this place I had heard and dreamt of for so long. But at the same time, it was a very, very bittersweet, very painful feeling that my mother wasn't with us. After that visit, being on cloud nine, it just, because of coming back here, as soon as we went back to Cyprus, I started nagging my father, when are we going to move back? When are we going to go back? Essentially, the process, that decision wasn't really in our hands either, because the PLO in any case was relocating all its institutions back to the West Bank and Gaza after the Oslo Accords. So in June 95, really, we as you said, we found ourselves coming back for good. And there the picture changed dramatically. because then I was no longer a guest or a visitor, a tourist, if you like. Rather, it was then that I really woke up to the reality that I was coming back, that I had just attained Israeli citizenship by virtue of my father's, that I would have to understand what it meant, first of all, to be a Palestinian inside Israel and to try and live this life. And from then on is when life got really, really complicated.
And I want to ask about, feelings, not only yours, actually. We never really talked about your brother, Musa. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about your feelings moving back to the village. What about family dynamics, difficulties, but also moments of joy?
Yes, I mean, when we first came back, we were just received into this wonderful, wonderful, I mean, I call it tide of love. It was just absolutely beautiful and mind-blowing. I mean, our relatives, both from both sides, from my mother's and my father's, couldn't believe we were among them. They showered us with love. They invited us to meals. We slept at their homes. We talked with my cousins. We went around the country. It was really, almost a mini paradise for those couple of weeks we were here in 94 at Christmas. In 95, after we came back, there were much more concrete things to worry about. We rented a house in the village belonging to one of my aunts. I had to find work. Musa had to prepare to go off to university in England. So for him, the decision to move back was a little less immediate in that sense. I mean, we moved back in June, and in September, Musa went to university. But I very much had to find a job and start integrating and so on. And yet, I think for both of us in June 95, as we were coming back, although, I really wanted this, my brother did not. And he really, really struggled with that decision. And I think for me, what happened is quickly, within a few months after moving back, I became terribly homesick for Cyprus. I hadn't really stopped to think of what Cyprus had meant in the meantime. The fact that, I grew up as an adolescent and a young adult there, and that it was really home. Coupled with the very, very rude awakening upon arriving here, which makes the challenge of coming here much more than the challenge of moving from one country to another, which you'll find is a universal challenge for people voluntarily leaving one place and going to another, or even involuntarily. But here, there's both the challenge of moving and the challenge of the specific place that we are moving to, and discovering the whole dynamic of discrimination, of racism, of having to learn Hebrew, of having to go and work in Israeli institutions, of having to redefine yourself and your whole identity vis-a-vis the other.
And certainly, I was struck by the story that you tell in the book, that you were at the airport and you saw a Hebrew study pack, and eventually you bought it, put it there in a corner, but eventually you had to delve into the question of the language. And that to me is very much representative of how you settle, but also struggle in the new context. Now, you already talked about yourself, what it means to resettle in a new context, particularly in the specific context of Israel and being a Palestinian. I'm also interested to learn a little bit more about your father, because at some point in the book, your father takes a second place. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about, what happened to him while you were struggling to gain your position in the village and in the new context.
Yes, I think in my father's case, it was a little easier and more clear-cut. And I think that's for a number of reasons. First of all, although he had been away for 24 years, this was really his frame of reference. He had been born here, he had grown up here, he had spent the first 30 years of his life here. So in a sense, Palestine to him was what Cyprus had been for us, if you look at it, in that way. So when he came back, really, even though he had been away for a quarter of the century, but I mean, the place for him, he knew the place, he knew the people. Yes, it changed a lot. In fact, he was really awestruck when he came back, for example, at the amount of change that had happened in the village. He told me it was unbelievable. I mean, I was walking along the roads that I remembered as purely being covered with olive trees. Suddenly, there were no trees there. It was houses and new roads and asphalt and entirely new neighborhoods that I didn't even, that were not there when I left. Also, the number of people in the village, obviously, in 25 years had multiplied. There were so many of them that he didn't know. But the other factor that made it easier for him, I think, is because he came back to a job. He didn't have to integrate in Israeli society, nor did he have to find a job. He resumed his job with the PLO, and he was going back and forth, initially to Gaza and later to Ramallah in the West Bank. He continued to work alongside Yasser Arafat. The Palestine Research Center had a couple of years where they tried to reestablish it in Jerusalem, but it was then closed. Together with the Orient House and a number of other institutions that Israel closed during the Second Intifada. But he remained a part of the PLO, and he continued to work, as I said. So in a sense, there wasn't a requirement for him at all to reintegrate back into Israeli society. His dealings with the village continued to be very remote, in the sense that, yes, he would come back on the weekends, but he wasn't really living in the village. It was only many years later, after Arafat died and after my father retired, shortly afterwards, that he came back and he resumed his life in the village full time. For long periods before that, he lived in Ramallah, and he went back and forth, and then in Jerusalem. So he came back and lived in the village. Today, when I talk to him about life here, he feels very much like an outsider in many ways, or an alien, because of the very different path that he chose for himself and his difficulty of finding like-minded people in the village. There are, people who sympathize with the path he took, who understand a bit more about the context, about the struggle of the Palestinians who are outside and who returned, and people who are more politically aware, but they are very few. So in a sense, he tells me, yes, I did fulfill my right of return. He very much insisted on coming back to Fassouta. But he says, underneath it all, now I find myself a stranger between several different worlds.
And I will go back to the question of feeling stranger later.
Yes.
But let me ask something now about you. So traveling, working, making friends, even finding an husband are not easy tasks if you're a Palestinian in Israel, for a variety of reasons. And I want to add for the listeners that this is not just to make a generalization. I know there are different cases, but in general, this is the experience. Were these challenges the reasons why you and your husband moved to Canada? Did you feel defeated?
Defeated, yes, for sure. I mean, my 8 years of living in Israel were fraught with stress and fear and rage. Also, as I began to discover this system and to find out really what it meant. Also, they were filled with very, very alienating emotions, because with my baggage, growing up as a Palestinian abroad in the diaspora, being in exile, losing my mother to the conflict, I was not emotionally ready in any shape or form to come back and live alongside Israelis and work with them. I just could never get my head around that concept. Because I was young when we came back, I was 22 years old. I think in that sense, it made it, I could say, a little bit easier because I did try. When I look back at it now, in a very naive kind of way, I tried in the workplaces I found myself in. I was working in IT at the time to make Israeli friends. And in fact, on a couple of occasions, I thought I succeeded. I had very good, cordial relations with a few people at work. We became friends. We would spend lunch breaks together and talk and chat and so on. Until the Second Intifada a few years later, and then I watched everything unravel and just completely fall apart. And I understood that the reason we called each other friends, or we thought we were friends, is simply because during all that time we never spoke about politics. My last workplace was in Carmiel in the north. Carmiel is a Jewish town built on the land expropriated from 3 Palestinian villages. That alone, I mean, that fact alone was something I thought about every day when I was there. I was working there during the Second Intifada, and I will never really be able to capture the atmosphere of utter alienation and oppression I felt going to work every day, sitting alongside fellow Israeli colleagues and listening to their extremely disparaging, terrible comments about what was happening, very vengeful comments, so much hatred, so much lack of understanding. And at that time, the couple of friends I had made there, when I eventually started telling them about my story, the shock and the silence and the denial that I found, and even the belittling of certain aspects of the story. I remember a conversation with one of them, a Jewish immigrant from Hungary who had come to Israel and married an Israeli. And I remember way back, even before I had even thought about really sitting down to write this book, I remember saying to her in passing, I'm thinking one day about writing a book about our story. And she said, immediately, she said, why? Do you think there's anything in your story that's interesting and worth talking or reading about? So very quickly, I saw this wall of defense that came up, this denial. She was horrified at the little bit that I told her about who my father was. And from that point on, though we never talked about it, though she never admitted it, that was the beginning of the end of the friendship. Sure enough, only a couple of years later, even though I kept trying to be in touch and I visited her, even after I had gone to Canada and come back, I visited her. I made a point of visiting her, but the friendship petered out. So really, at the time, the decision to immigrate to Canada was very much this. Yes, I was tired. I had been here for 8 years, and I saw in those 8 years that there is no way I can acclimatize to this life, coupled with financial problems and so on, and Canada opening its doors for immigration. And I thought, I just want to get away from here and start life somewhere else. I did not know how much this place had seeped into my consciousness in the meantime.
With the Second Intifada, the harsh repression of the Palestinians and of the PLO, which eventually disappeared essentially from Palestine, the separation wall, the emergence of right-wing governments within Israel, which are still in power. After divorcing, which is another personal trauma, you eventually move back to the village. And once again, and that struck me personally, you lost your mom. And while working in Ramallah, as you say in the book, you began to see how deeply the Israeli occupation damaged all sectors of Palestinian life, social, political, economic. Can you take us through the last few years discussed in the book?
Yes, the last few years in the book are basically when I was able to just look at it all from almost like a bird's eye view, because I had lived in Ramallah by that time for about 8 or 9 years. Interestingly, equal to the amount of years I had spent inside Israel before leaving, for making the decision to leave. After about the 7 or 8 year mark in Ramallah is when things really began to go downhill for me in terms of really opening my eyes to the situation. The first few years that I was there, I was so busy with the idea of reclaiming Palestine, my own personal reclamation of Palestine. Here I was in a Palestinian place. I mean, again, the naivety that I look at in myself, both when I first moved to Fassouta and when I went to Ramallah, there's almost a shared naivety in both, because I really didn't know what to expect. So my first few years in Ramallah, the Palestinian flag is fluttering on buildings. I'm speaking Arabic. I'm among fellow Palestinians. Not everything has been lost. There's this sense almost of reclaiming the homeland. But then, as you live in the place day after day, you start finding out about the checkpoints, about the barriers to entry, about the settler violence, about the violence perpetrated by the Israeli army, the incursions at all times of day and night. You listen to people's memories of the intifadas. what had been happening to them. You looked at the intricate network of checkpoints and roadblocks and, prohibitions to movement that are scattered all around the West Bank. You look at the economy and how subservient it is to Israel, how it's been engineered that way by the Oslo Accords, and altogether a very, very grim picture forms in your mind. The last few years that I was in Ramallah, all of this picked up. The intensity of all of this picked up. The settler project became even more voracious. It was clear that these people were on a mission to really take over as much Palestinian land and properties as possible. The settlers, in conjunction with the Israeli army under their protection, East Jerusalem was just being pummeled. Every place of Palestinian presence was really being targeted. And I felt very much a gradual but very, very distinct breakdown, particularly living in Ramallah, because, there was always this huge discord between the Palestinian Authority and its institutions behaving like they were a country when, in fact, they were not. There was a discord between the life and the statements made by the officials and by the suffering of the ordinary individual people. The book ended with the assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh. I worked for Al Jazeera for a number of years. Shireen was obviously a colleague, but in the Arabic department, I worked for the English. When I ended the book with Shireen's death, I ended because I had finished and I wanted to publish the book, but I knew that there was no ending, that it was definitely not an ending. I knew that the ending had simply marked that point in time. The last few years in Ramallah were very, very, painful. They were really just day after day after day of watching the relentless Israeli onslaught. I've often asked myself, in almost satirical kind of way, like, I'm like, wow, how do these people summon up all the energy to engineer this massive system of repression? And I always said to my friends, again, it may sound like a very naive question, but I always said, can you imagine if all of this energy was actually channeled into a proper peace process and economic cooperation and, peace, real peace, and all its different pillars, and how far this would have gotten us by now?
I have a couple of more questions, but there's one thing I want to ask just to, change a little bit of the tone of a discussion, which is heavy in many ways, and it should be like that because obviously we are talking about important things. But there's one character in the book that I found extremely relevant. That is Kojak.
Yes, my cat.
Exactly. I found it amazing. First of all, I was thinking about younger generations reading the book and thinking about who is this character, Telly Savalas, the actor, and Kojak, which of course is about our generation. What happened to the cat?
Kojak played a key role in our childhood. We loved her very much. Obviously, when we were about to leave Beirut, we were severely traumatized. We had just lost my mother. It was actually a semi-miracle that Kojak had survived up until that point, because during the war, and I recount this in the book, we were away from home for long periods of time. Beirut was a complete and utter hellhole, comparable to what is happening in Gaza today. There was simply no place of safety. People frantically ran from one place to another, depending on the Israeli air raids. This meant that we had to be away from home for long periods of time, and my father was on the run pretty much constantly, because it wasn't just the shelling from above, it was also the repeated Israeli attempts to assassinate him through their agents in Beirut at the time. When he could, he snuck back to our apartment to feed the cat, but as I said, it's a miracle that she stayed alive. As we were about to leave, and I am completely heartbroken, and then in tears, I'm asking my father, what do we do with Kojak? And my uncle came to the rescue. He came to our house and he told me, okay, there's Haj Yahya. I said, who's Haj Yahya? He said, he is a very kind caretaker of a building nearby. He loves cats. He has swarms of them that he takes care of in the underground parking lot. And I've asked him, I mean, my uncle made a big show of it. He's going to adopt Kojak and she's going to be fine and he's going to take care of her. And he bundled the cat in a box and off he went. As a child, I believed him. Later on in life, I often wondered if in fact he had done that. And even as I wrote this book, it suddenly came to my mind to ask him. I was almost afraid of the answer. And in fact, it was only a couple of years ago, even after the book had come out, that I suddenly one day remembered and I said to him, Ammo, which means uncle, was it true that you took Kojak to this man? And he smiled and he said, yes, it was. He was somebody that I knew really in the area and he loved cats and I entrusted this cat with him. I left her with him. And I was so glad when he told me that, even, more than 30 years later. But Roberto, it's interesting that you asked this question, because really, this whole issue of forced expulsion from a place, and of the fact that you have no preparedness for it, and this violent loss of people and things that you love, and what that means, especially to a child who, has no idea why all of this is happening. I mean, we didn't even understand, why had this happened to my mother at the time? My younger brother understood nothing. He was 5 years old. He just kept asking when Mama was going to come home. And for me, obviously I was older. I understood that she had gone. But again, there was a part of us that didn't really absorb it. I mean, you are talking about young children. I kept sometimes in my mind's eye, I would imagine her walking through the door and laughing and telling us, no, it was all a mistake, and taking us in her arms. So, it was one loss after another. As a child, the loss of Kojak was also a pretty big loss in our lives.
You talked about your father nowadays and how he feels somewhat a stranger in his own village. But do you still feel like a stranger in your own land?
It is quite amazing, and I was quite stunned when I had this conversation with my father, and he told me, I was born here, I grew up here, and I never really felt like I was a part of this village because of the political path that he took. And he said, even after coming back all these years, I still feel I'm a stranger, not only in Fassouta, but everywhere. And once in an interview he gave, he said, I'm a stranger among my own village in Fassouta. I'm also a stranger. I'm a stranger in Fassouta because of my political path and my different view of things, and the road I took in my life and my work and so on, and my views. But I'm equally a stranger among the Palestinians I worked with in the PLO and in other places, because I come from here and I'm from a different place and I have a different reality and I grew up in Israel and so on. This feeling of being a stranger has been a thread for him through his life. And when I actually asked him, I said, Baba, where do you belong? And he said, actually, nowhere. What stunned me about it is that this is exactly how I feel. So in a way, this was exactly transferred generationally. I'm the same. And in fact, I suspect my brother is the same, although we talk less about these things. He's more, as I think, a more practical mindset, but very much strangers, everywhere we go. And my brother tried to put the matter at ease for me a few months back. We were having a conversation and he said to me, listen, perhaps acceptance is the way to go about this, that we will experience this feeling everywhere, that we simply have no roots and we didn't choose it that way. It was because of the very peculiar circumstances in our lives. And he said, sometimes accepting that you are a nomad spirit wherever you go may help in reducing your own inner struggle to always need to find a place to belong. And I think after all these years, I'm starting to come to terms with that, also because after many, many years, I came back this year and I lived with my father for a year and I see how he goes about his life. It's very sad in a way, because all the components that make you feel settled in a place are not there. I mean, he's settled on the outside like I am. People look at me and yes, you're in the village, you live here, blah, blah, blah. But the inner psychological component of being rooted in a place, even though I come back to it, I always come back to it, but I always feel like a stranger.
I have one last question, and it's very personal in many ways. Your father is an important figure in recent Palestinian history. Like myself, many historians, many people working on Palestine certainly heard his name, or myself read his writings. How did it feel growing up next to it?
Yes, this is an interesting question, Roberto, and it's a discussion I've had with sometimes with some other children of similar personalities. It's a very different life from the ordinary. You are growing up in the shadow, not just of a person, but of everything that person represents. You grow up with the father and the cause. The two are almost indistinguishable from each other. Most of my conversations with my father have been about this issue. I mean, I remember throughout my life, so many conversations have been about Palestine and Israel and this issue. The boundaries between the father and the cause that he represents are very blurry. I myself see my father very much in that light. At the same time, it's often very painful and it takes a big toll on the children. And this is part of the discussion I was having with, another friend in a similar situation, because so many of your normal moments of a parent-child relationship are stolen, either because you eventually end up living through very difficult circumstances because of the choice your father made or continues to make, or because simply by the nature of his work, he is so preoccupied and engrossed in it. Certainly over the years, he tried to do the best that he can, but again, the personal stress he felt all of the time wore off on us. The first point for expression of any stress anybody feels in their life is usually their immediate family. As children, we very, very much pay the price for our parents' decisions, and I think that's true not only in the political sense, but in many other things as well. Growing up with a parent with this profile has contradictions in the sense that I'm both very proud for him and also very sad because of so much pain that we as a family have lived through. So it's very complex emotions there, and I think it took me a long time. Also through writing this book, I really came to know my father in a way that I never had before, because I had to ask him very, very detailed questions about the past that I wouldn't have known if he hadn't told me. So it's only really in the last few years that I've really created a new relationship with him or come to a new understanding of this figure in my life.
This was Fida Jiyris, author of Stranger in My Own Land, Palestine, Israel, and One Family Story of All. Fida, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Roberto. It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.